They laughed at your presence, but their laughter had tremors. It was the kind that only erupts when someone senses a threat they can't name. They called you dramatic. They called you intense. They called you too much, but never once did they call you replaceable. That's what they buried beneath the jokes and smirks and cold shoulders, the undeniable truth that your energy was the bloodstream of the entire dynamic. Without you, the air became stale, the conversations became shallow, the room lost its electricity, and in their darkest, most private thoughts, they knew it. They knew they were feeding off your spark, your kindness, your unwavering ability to carry the weight of moments that would have otherwise collapsed under their own superficiality. They didn't just enjoy your presence, they survived on it. They built their world on borrowed oxygen, yours. Every time you stood tall in rooms that tried to shrink you, you created shelter for people who could barely stand under the weight of their own cowardice. You became a beacon, not for admiration, but for emotional dependency. You were the one they called when their masks slipped, the one who translated their confusion into clarity, the one who sat still when everyone else scattered. They mistook your ability to handle storms as your job to carry theirs. And so they drained you subtly, consistently, with fake concern and half-baked gratitude. They didn't fear losing you, because they assumed you'd always be accessible. But you weren't built to be a battery for the weak-willed. You were built to wake them up. And when they refused to evolve, you withdrew the current. And without it, they crumbled. They tried to rewrite history when you left, claimed you were unstable, that you changed, that you grew cold. But those were just excuses told to silence their own guilt, because deep down, they remembered the nights they leaned on you, when no one else answered. They remembered the way your presence reset the temperature in the room. They remembered how you pulled them from their spirals with nothing but a few words and an unshaken tone. They remembered your silence when they were lashing out, and how it never came from fear, but from control. You were their lighthouse, but they took it for granted. They thought the light would keep spinning regardless of their disrespect. Until one day, it didn't. And suddenly, they were left with themselves. And nothing felt warm anymore. They weren't addicted to your kindness. They were addicted to the energy beneath it. That unyielding resilience. That insane capacity to regenerate after every emotional injury. They needed that proximity to your fire because they had none of their own. That's the secret they'll never say out loud. That they envied you, even while depending on you. That they resented you for showing up with clarity when they were drowning in self-made fog. That they watched you, obsessively, trying to decode what kept you grounded while their lives felt like constant collapse. You became their spiritual crutch, their emotional cheat code. But you were never built to be leaned on forever. You were built to walk alone and to show others how. They just chose to crawl and pretend they were flying. They were afraid of the day you would finally realize that you were the force keeping everything together, because that's the day their illusion would die. So they mocked your empathy, downplayed your insight, criticized your intensity. It was all smoke to keep you from seeing the scale of your own power. Because once you realized they needed your spirit more than you needed their presence, it was over. The dynamic shattered. Your growth rendered their manipulation useless. They couldn't guilt you, couldn't flatter you, couldn't distract you. You saw through it all. And with that vision came the most devastating act of all, departure without explanation. They tried to replace you, pathetically. Like using paper to block the wind. They searched for someone else who could match your presence. Someone who could hold space, offer wisdom, breathe fire into dead conversations. But they only found mirrors, fragile, shallow, easily cracked. They didn't need another friend, they needed a furnace. Someone whose very existence pushed them to be more than what they were. They couldn't find it. They won't. Because people like you aren't manufactured. You're forged. And that's the difference. They were built in reaction. You were built in fire. Their replacements looked the part, but couldn't carry the weight. And it showed. Now they reminisce, quietly, in private, because pride keeps people from confessing the ways they broke their own blessings. They don't post about you. They don't reach out, but they remember. In every moment they feel stuck. In every interaction that lacks depth. In every silence that doesn't soothe. You echo in the spaces they tried to fill with noise. They remember the stability you gave them, and they feel the void it left. That's the kind of revenge only life can deliver. Not loud, not messy, but slow and inescapable. The universe took your hands away from their shoulders, and suddenly, their foundation began to shake. The worst part for them wasn't losing you. It was realizing they never really had you to begin with. They had access, but not understanding. Proximity, but not intimacy. They interacted with your light while mocking the source. They sipped from your spirit like it was a faucet, something that could be turned on and off at will. But you weren't water. You were a tide. And when you receded, they learned the hard way that their survival was never about their strength. It was about your mercy. The moment you stopped offering it, they drowned in their own shallow waters. You didn't change. You just stopped shrinking. You stopped apologizing for being the person they depended on, but never appreciated. You stopped offering pieces of yourself to people who only showed up with empty hands and open mouths. You didn't turn cold. You just turned sacred, reserved, specific. You stopped trying to be understood by those who weaponized your complexity. And when you did, you stepped into something they'll never touch again. Freedom. The kind that doesn't need closure or revenge, just distance. And the kind of peace that punishes more than any war ever could. Their darkest secret was never about hate. It was dependence. And that dependence disguised itself as criticism, mockery, and sabotage. Because people who know they can't live without you will try to convince the world that you're expendable. Just to keep you close. Just to keep you unaware. But the moment you saw it, the pattern, the theft, the hollow performances, it was over. You reclaimed your spirit, and in doing so, you exposed their truth. They needed your soul to survive. And they failed. Because they never learned how to value what they couldn't replicate. They stood there rehearsing a speech they would never get to deliver. They sharpened their tone, laced their words with just enough poison to sound righteous, and planned every sentence like a weapon, aimed at pulling you back into the storm they could never escape from. They didn't want reconciliation. They didn't want truth. They wanted theater. One last act. One more moment where you'd raise your voice, crack your calm, surrender your poise just long enough for them to feel powerful again. Because that's what they missed the most. Not you, but the illusion of control they once had when your emotions were within their reach. But you gave them none of it. You gave them a mirror, not a stage. You offered no retort, just your absence. And it echoed louder than any argument they had prepared. They called it closure. But closure was never the goal. Control was. They didn't want to resolve anything. They wanted to spin the story one more time. Twist your meaning. Mock your growth. Pull on the old threads of pain you've already cauterized in silence. Because nothing terrified them more than the version of you that doesn't react. You, calm, collected and gone. That's what unraveled them. Because when they launched their final monologue, full of veiled blame and recycled justifications, it hit nothing but air. You weren't there, not in presence, not in emotion, not in energy. They were yelling at ghosts, performing for shadows. And when the silence answered back, it said everything you never had to. They dialed your name expecting chaos. They wanted the fireworks, the back and forth, the passionate rebuttal they could turn into ammunition for later. But instead, they got the dead tone of distance. You left them mid-script, mouths full of venom with no one left to bite. They still rehearsed the argument long after you hung up, imagining the version of you they used to provoke. But that version died the moment you realized that peace costs less than participation. And you paid the fee gladly, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that the game was beneath you. You didn't walk away because you were weak. You walked away because nothing they offered was worth the fire they wanted you to relight. They wanted to be relevant. They wanted to be your equal in conflict because they could never match you in clarity. They wanted one more scene where you lost composure so they could pretend they never lost control. That was their final hope. that if they could trigger you just once more, they could spin it as proof that you were still trapped in the cycle. But the trap only works when you move, and you didn't. You let the silence thicken. Let it press on their ego. Let it scream in their head louder than any words you ever said. Your absence became the proof that they had nothing left to grasp. They waited for your reaction like addicts wait for a high. Sweaty, palmed, heart racing. But you left them sober, withdrawn. They replayed your last interaction 100 times, trying to decode it, searching for signs that you were just pretending. But it wasn't a game. You had simply grown too clean for their chaos to stick. And that's the part they'll never understand. Sometimes silence is not avoidance. It's a boundary, a permanent, unnegotiable line that says, this chapter ends here. They didn't just lose the argument. They lost access to you as an opponent. And without that, they lost their entire script. You never gave them the performance. And now they sit with a spotlight and no actor, no dialogue, just echoes of a confrontation that never came. They talk to your absence now. They fill rooms with your name, trying to conjure the ghost of your former reactions. But ghosts don't haunt the healed. You don't return for round 2, when round 1 already taught you the cost of staying. They narrate both sides now, playing victim and villain interchangeably, depending on who listens. But what they can't manufacture is the dignity you left with, the kind of exit that doesn't need a door slam. Just a vanishing of energy so absolute, it shuts down every frequency they used to reach you. What breaks them now is the quiet. They thought silence was something they could overpower with noise. They tried to shout through it, mock it, fill it with distractions. But your silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they feared. It held the boundaries you never vocalized, the forgiveness you granted without ceremony, the end they didn't expect. They tried to lure you back with accusations dressed as concern, provoke you with half-truths and cheap provocations. But you didn't even flinch, because true growth doesn't perform, it exits. They pace the floor with phones in hand, half expecting your name to reappear. But ghosts don't text back you were done. Not in spite, not in anger, in peace. And peace has a tone that drowns out manipulation. They still test the waters occasionally, casting baited messages into the silence, hoping you'll relapse into a conversation. But all they catch now is reflection, the kind that forces them to see what they are without your emotional labor, propping up the illusion of balance. You were their anchor, even while they pretended you were the storm. They don't say your name with anger anymore. They say it with tension, a reverence laced with regret, because they know. They know that the person who once would have met them in the fire now lives above the smoke, that the argument they planned so meticulously died in your stillness. And the final truth they can't swallow is this: you didn't leave them unanswered. You left them with the only answer that could never be manipulated: nothing. Not apathy, not indifference, just nothing. A clean break so brutal it became biblical. Now, they live inside a monologue with no audience. Their words bounce off walls, unanswered. Their stories no longer hold traction, because you gave them the cruelest gift of all: no reaction, no role, no relevance. Just their own voice reverberating, endlessly in a room you no longer occupy. And in that hollow echo, they finally hear it, the sound of their powerlessness, and the proof that you, in your silence, became everything they feared most.